there is a particular kind of person you have probably crossed paths with at least once in your life. They were not the loudest in the room. They did not announce their plans, share their goals on social media, or make sure everyone around them knew what they were working toward. They just worked. And then one day, without warning, without a dramatic reveal, you looked up and realized they had already arrived somewhere most people were still trying to find directions to. They had built something, achieved something, or transformed something, and the rest of the world was only just catching on. That moment, that quiet arrival, is not an accident. It is the product of a very specific psychological makeup, and understanding it might be one of the most important things you ever do. Most of us have been taught, either directly or through the culture we grew up in, that success is supposed to be loud. We are surrounded by highlight reels, announcement posts, and carefully crafted personal brands. The modern world has made self-promotion feel almost obligatory, like if you are not talking about what you are doing, you are somehow doing it wrong. But there exists a group of people who operate from an entirely different psychological framework. These individuals have, consciously or unconsciously, unlocked a way of moving through the world that protects their energy, sharpens their focus, and dramatically increases their chances of actually finishing what they start. They are the quiet winners. And the science behind how they think is nothing short of extraordinary. Psychologists have long studied the difference between people who are driven by external validation and those who are propelled by something internal. The formal terms are extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. Someone who is extrinsically motivated needs the applause, the likes, the comments, the recognition, and the visible markers of progress to keep going. When those rewards dry up, so does the effort. But someone who is intrinsically motivated finds the fuel somewhere inside themselves, in the satisfaction of growth, in the private pleasure of mastery, in the deeply personal meaning they have attached to what they are doing. Research consistently shows that intrinsic motivation produces deeper engagement, longer persistence, and significantly better outcomes over time. Quiet winners tend to live almost entirely in this intrinsic space. What makes this psychologically fascinating is that the choice to move quietly is rarely a choice made out of shyness or insecurity. In fact, the research suggests the opposite. Studies in self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, point to the idea that genuine psychological strength comes from a feeling of autonomy, a belief in one's own competence, and a sense of purpose that is not dependent on what others think. People who succeed without anyone noticing are not hiding because they are afraid. They are moving without noise because they have already answered the question that most people spend their whole lives asking. They know why they are doing what they are doing, and that internal clarity makes the external noise irrelevant. There is also a neurological component to this that researchers have begun to explore in recent years. When a person announces a goal publicly, the brain receives a small but measurable reward. The social acknowledgement, the congratulations, the supportive reactions, they trigger the same pleasure pathways that are supposed to be reserved for actually achieving the goal. In effect, the brain gets a preview of the reward before the work is done. And once that preview has been enjoyed, the urgency to complete the task quietly diminishes. Quiet winners, whether they know it or not, are protecting themselves from this neurological trap. By keeping their goals private, they preserve the full weight of that reward for the moment of actual completion, which means their drive stays intact across the entire journey, not just at the beginning. The relationship between silence and strategy runs deeper than most people realize. Quiet winners are not passive. They are not waiting for things to happen to them. What looks like stillness from the outside is often intense, deliberate, concentrated effort happening entirely beneath the surface. Researchers who study high performers across industries, from athletics to business to creative fields, have consistently found that the people who reach the top levels of their craft share a common trait. They protect their focus with almost obsessive discipline. They understand on a gut level that attention is a finite resource. Every time energy is redirected toward performing progress rather than making it, there is a cost. Quiet winners refuse to pay that cost. One of the most compelling patterns that emerges when you study these individuals is their relationship with patience. In a culture that rewards speed and instant results, quiet winners think in longer arcs. They are not looking for a quick turnaround. They have internalized something that behavioral psychologists call delayed gratification, the ability to resist an immediate reward in favor of a larger, later one. The famous Stanford marshmallow experiments from the 1970s, which tracked children's ability to wait for a second marshmallow, became one of the most cited studies in psychology, partly because of what the follow-up research revealed. The children who could wait tended to have better outcomes later in life across multiple areas, not because waiting was inherently virtuous, but because it reflected a deeper capacity for self-regulation. Quiet winners have that capacity in abundance. Self-regulation is at the heart of nearly everything that separates quiet achievers from people who burn brightly and briefly. Psychologist Roy Baumeister, whose work on willpower and self-control spans decades, found that people who exercise consistent self-regulation tend to do so not through constant struggle, but through the design of their habits and environments. They reduce the need for willpower by reducing temptation and distraction in the first place. Quiet winners often do this instinctively. They limit who knows what they are doing, which limits the conversations that drain energy. They limit how often they check for external feedback, which limits the emotional swings that come from other people's opinions. They build a container around their work, and inside that container they are free. There's something almost counterintuitive about how quiet winners handle failure, and it is one of the most instructive things about them. When most people fail, especially publicly, the experience carries an additional layer of social weight. The failure has witnesses. It has to be explained, reframed, or defended. But quiet winners, because they have kept their process private, experience failure in a much simpler way. It is just information, just data. There is no audience to manage, no narrative to protect, no identity tied to being seen as someone who never stumbles. Psychologists who study resilience have found that the ability to treat failure as feedback rather than as a verdict on one's worth is one of the strongest predictors of long-term success. Quiet winners have a structural advantage here that is easy to underestimate. They also have a very particular relationship with comparison. Social comparison theory, introduced by psychologist Leon Festinger in the 1950s, explains the very human tendency to measure ourselves against those around us. It is a process that can motivate in small doses, but tends to corrode over time, especially in the age of curated social media profiles, where everyone else's life looks like a highlight reel. Quiet winners are not immune to comparison, but they have, in many cases, deliberately reduced their exposure to it. By spending less time broadcasting and less time consuming the broadcast of others, they create psychological breathing room that most people never get to experience. That breathing room becomes a competitive advantage. Understanding the inner world of a quiet winner also requires looking at how they relate to identity. For many people, what they do and who they are becomes so tightly tangled that any threat to the doing feels like a threat to the being. This is why public declarations of goals can be psychologically dangerous. If you tell the world you are going to do something and then you don't, the failure is not just about the goal. It feels like a statement about your character. Quiet winners have either through experience or intuition separated the doing from the identity. They know who they are independently of what is currently happening in their work. That separation gives them a stability that allows them to take bigger risks, pivot more freely, and keep going through the stretches where progress is invisible even to themselves. There is a concept in psychology called psychological safety, the feeling that you can take risks, make mistakes, and be yourself without fear of negative consequences. Research pioneered by Harvard professor Amy Edmondson showed that teams with high psychological safety consistently outperformed those without it. Not because safety makes people comfortable and complacent, but because it frees them to bring their full intelligence to the table. Quiet winners essentially create their own private psychological safety. By limiting external scrutiny of their process, they give themselves permission to experiment, to be wrong, to take unconventional paths without the anxiety that comes from being watched. The result is a creative and strategic freedom that most people never access. It would be a mistake to romanticize silence for its own sake. There are people who stay quiet because they are paralyzed, people who keep their goals private because they are afraid to commit, and people who avoid sharing because vulnerability terrifies them. That is not the psychology being described here. The distinction is in what the silence enables. For quiet winners, privacy is productive. It serves the work. It creates the conditions under which genuine progress can happen. When the goal is achieved, they are not reluctant to be seen. They simply spent their energy building the thing rather than narrating the building of it. The outcome speaks, and they let it. The people who tend to be most drawn to quiet winning often share a history of having learned, through painful experience, that talking about plans before they are realized has a cost. Maybe they announced something and then could not follow through. Maybe they found that sharing too early invited opinions that derailed them, or comparisons that discouraged them, or praise that peaked too soon. Or maybe they simply discovered through trial and error that their best work happened in the absence of an audience. However they arrived at it, the lesson became embedded in how they approach everything. Process is private, results are proof. Everything else is noise. The social dynamics that surround quiet winners are often deeply misread by the people around them. They get labeled as secretive, as cold, as arrogant even by those who interpret the absence of sharing as superiority. But what is actually happening is something far less dramatic. These individuals have simply placed a higher priority on the quality of their output than on the experience of being perceived as productive. There is a profound difference between those two things, and most people never stop long enough to feel it. Being seen as busy and actually making progress are two entirely different experiences that, in the noise of modern life, often get mistaken for each other. What quiet winners also tend to share is an unusual tolerance for uncertainty. The period between starting something and finishing it is inherently uncomfortable. There's no guarantee of outcome. There is no applause for the middle. There is only the work and the belief that the work is worth doing. Most people manage that discomfort by seeking reassurance, by sharing, by asking for feedback, by building an audience that validates the process. Quiet winners sit in the discomfort differently. They have developed what psychologists sometimes call ambiguity tolerance, an ability to function effectively even when the outcome is unclear and the path is not yet visible. It is not that they are not anxious. It is that the anxiety does not stop them. The connection between quiet achievement and emotional intelligence is worth examining closely. Research into emotional intelligence, which encompasses self-awareness, emotional regulation, and the ability to understand and navigate the emotions of others, consistently shows that high emotional intelligence is linked to better decision-making, stronger relationships, and greater resilience. Quiet winners tend to score high in the aspects of emotional intelligence related to self-management. They know their triggers. They understand the difference between a productive emotion and a destructive one. They have learned to observe their inner experience without being hijacked by it. This gives them a kind of internal steadiness that other people can sense, even if they cannot name it. There is a quality that is hard to pin down but easy to recognize when you are in the presence of someone who embodies it. It is something like groundedness, a sense that the person in front of you is not trying to be anywhere else, not performing anything for your benefit, not waiting for your assessment. They are simply here, doing what they do on their own timeline, in their own way. That quality is magnetic. And paradoxically, it tends to attract far more genuine attention and respect than any amount of deliberate self-promotion. The world notices the people who do not seem to need its notice. The quiet winners, in the end, are rarely quiet forever. They just choose their moment. There is a version of success that the world has been selling for a long time, and it is built on visibility, volume, and the constant performance of progress. And then there is another version, older and quieter and far more durable, built on intrinsic purpose, disciplined focus, and the willingness to let the work carry its own weight. The people who find their way to the second version often cannot tell you exactly how they got there. It was something they felt rather than decided. A shift in what mattered to them. A realization that the energy spent on being seen was energy taken away from becoming great. If you have ever felt that shift, even faintly, even for a moment, then you already understand more about this psychology than most people ever will. The question is simply whether you are willing to trust it.